and I hope everyone got enough peace, and I think there's still some.
Professor Schanzer is a professor at UNC Chapel Hill. He has worked on Capitol Hill, the Department of Defense, and is an expert in most of the subjects that counterterrorism policy could possibly encompass. So here he is. I encourage you to take your best look.
Great. Thank you for inviting me. What Tim did mention is I'm a lawyer. So I like coming to Duke Law School, walking across the street. I heard Walter Dellinger talk once about how he was in the White House counsel's office for a while, and then I think he got appointed to be an appointment in the Justice Department, and coming back to the Justice Department after being in the helter-skelter of the White House was like kind of touching home base, like a place you could, where things were more settled, where you had points of reference, and the law is like that compared to the world of policy. When I worked on the Hill, of course, if you tell your senator, well, we can't do that, the law prohibits you from doing that, their response is, well, let's just change the law. And of course, you do talk about questions about what the law should be in law school, not just how to apply the laws that are there, but it's a different way of thinking. So I do like coming across the street and coming back to my kind of home base, which is the law, and engaging in discussion like that. What I thought I would talk about today, briefly, is kind of the debate we were having here at the end of the Bush administration and the beginning of the Obama administration in terms of what's the direction of our counterterrorism policies. And I think the prevailing sentiment is that there has been with the beginning of the Obama administration, we have charted a new course. There's going to be a sea change of all of our policies across the board in this area. Out with the old, in with the new. And my impression is actually opposite, is that in general, we're going to have more continuity than change. And so I wanted to throw that out there to you and go through some of these ideas, and then hopefully we can have a discussion, because I'm not going to talk for that long. Now, the debate has clearly been engaged, because the Bush administration, right in their last couple of months, after not beating their chest too much, really, about not being any attacks, really did start to beat their chest at the end and saying we've achieved great things, all due to the various policies, whether it be from the war in Iraq all the way through to surveillance, detention, interrogation, and the like, Patriot Act. And then, so Obama comes in, of course, and says during his inaugural that we can be secure without sacrificing our values, and right with the president sitting right next to him, laying down the gauntlet a little bit. Then issuing, of course, the 3 executive orders on January 22nd relating to Guantanamo, closing Guantanamo, and changes in interrogation policy. And we can talk about those in a little bit more detail. And that's where I said the commentators, the punditocracy, looked at that and said, this is a revolution, this is a sea change, this is charting a whole new direction on counterterrorism. And then just a couple weeks ago, Dick Cheney, not wasting any time out of getting office and being provocative, said, in commenting, I think, during an interview on a question about these new policies, said, when you have people who are more concerned with reading rights to al-Qaeda terrorists than they are with protecting the United States against people who are absolutely committed to taking American lives, then I worry a great deal. So clearly saying that, well, our policies worked for 7 years. These policies he doesn't believe are going to work, and we might well be attacked. So again, he's arguing as well, a big sea change, a great alteration in our policy, and he kind of laying down the gauntlet. If something happens, it's all your fault because you are abandoning these policies. So there's the debate that we're at. That's where things are right now. Well, let's take a step back and look at the full range of policies that comprise our response to 9/11, which I categorize maybe with too broad a brush as our counterterrorism set of counterterrorism policies. First, and try to see where there have been points there have been large-scale changes, where there have not. The first point I would say is the point about preemptive war. Clearly, Bush had this concept that we were going to intervene, we were going to try to preempt attacks at a much earlier stage than really international law had previously allowed, a more preemptive regime, which is what was used to justify going into Iraq. Now, if you look at his second term, however, the notion towards preemptive war clearly got very tamped down, even though there were many in his close circle who wanted to continue to go in that direction in terms of both North Korea and Iran. And then, of course, we had the story about that broke, I think, in December or January, about how the Bush administration had actually denied Israel overflight rights over Iraq to strike at Iran's nuclear capability. So I would argue that although Bush believed and used this idea of preemptive war very strongly in his first term, had moved away from that towards his second term. Now, of course, Obama voiced opposition to Iraq before the war, but we don't really know where he'll go when first tested in this area. Clearly, during the campaign, he's voiced a lot of support for using more diplomacy to resolve conflicts, not relying so much on military force. But this whole idea of preemptive war is a question of when is something become imminent enough to justify the use of force. It's very much a sliding scale. And while he said Iraq was a mistake, this is an issue I would just say the jury is still out. We don't really know. And on Iran, unlike Bush, who pretty much could be confident that Iran would not be able to develop a nuclear weapon during his term in office, we really don't know with Iran. And it's likely that if they keep going forward and there's not some sort of negotiated settlement, Obama may face this very real issue of Iran developing a nuclear warhead during his term in office, and he will have to face this question: is when is an imminent threat so imminent that force is required? So I'm not saying at all on this point that Obama and Bush are policies that there will be continuity. All I'm saying is that there's Bush moved away to the idea of preemptive war in his first term, and we don't really know where Obama will ultimately go when the issue is becomes ripe. A second aspect of counterterrorism policy, the idea that states that sponsor or allow terrorism to take place within their borders are accountable for those actions. Another kind of core idea of the Bush doctrine, let's say. And the corollary to that is that if a country is either unwilling or unable to police terrorism within its own borders, then the United States will intervene and take some action to protect our national interests that are going, even if it means infringing on the sovereignty of other countries. Now, this issue, I don't think we really see very much difference between the Bush and Obama approach at all. Indeed, Obama was criticized by Clinton, Biden, his Secretary of State, his Vice President, and then his presidential opponent, John McCain, when he said that he would aggressively, if he had information about the whereabouts of al-Qaeda inside of Pakistan, that he would aggressively use force to try to take bin Laden out. Both Clinton, Biden, and McCain said this is naive. We have alliances with Pakistan we have to be concerned about. You don't target what you're going to do in advance on an issue of that sensitivity. Now, of course, after the Musharraf government fell, Bush endorsed the policy of missile strikes inside of Pakistan, much as what Obama had been talking about through much of the campaign. They were much more aggressive about going after targets in the Fatah region, essentially trying to, because Pakistan seemed not necessarily unwilling, but certainly unable to control infiltration over to Afghanistan, to take these aggressive actions. So in very much in line. And then after Obama was inaugurated, there were missile attacks within days of his inauguration at al-Qaeda or Taliban targets inside of Pakistan. So in this regard, I see full continuity between the policies that Bush was taking and Obama has followed and is likely to continue following that aspect of the Bush doctrine. Then there's a question of targeted killings is another policy that we have pursued, which is similar to what has been going on in Pakistan. These are very covert. Many things might happen without our knowledge, and we don't know. But again, I expect, given what Obama said, that if there was a serious target, during the campaign, if there was a serious target, terrorist target that we had no other way of abducting or taking action against, that he may well favor similar actions to what Bush did. So those are kind of in the foreign policy counterterrorism area. We've also taken lots of steps, what I would call in preemptive law enforcement and intelligence, things that we are doing to try to find out about the terrorist actions before they take place, get information so we can take action, either detaining individuals, killing them, interrogating them to find out information, surveilling them. A whole set of these kind of preemptive tactics. First one, of course, is the techniques of interrogation to be used against enemy prisoners. And here, clearly, the executive orders marked a significant departure between Obama and Bush, where the executive order said on January 22nd that Obama would only use the techniques that are established in the Army Field Manual for interrogation, which are not the waterboarding and other interrogation techniques that were used and have been used and authorized for the CIA to use in interrogating prisoners. However, one thing that people didn't comment on is that Obama left the door open, at least slightly, to potentially using those kinds of tactics in the future. The executive order creates a special task force to look into interrogation policy, and it says that one of the missions of that task force would be to study and evaluate whether the interrogation practices and techniques in the Army Field Manual, when employed by departments or agencies outside the military, provide an appropriate means for acquiring the intelligence necessary to protect the nation, and if warranted, to recommend any additional or different guidance for other departments or agencies. I mean, this is clearly just having this a notion that we would actually use interrogation techniques beyond the Army Field Manual is certainly not the Amnesty International line towards how we should deal with interrogation. Just the mere thought that these types of tactics could be used at all is definitely a departure from the kind of strict human rights approach. And while of course I think it's laudable and it's important that Obama has made this break from the past practice, the fact that he's left this door open still shows that there's some possibility of moving back in that direction. On the question of detaining dangerous detainees, terrorists, suspected terrorists, yes, Obama has said we're going to shut down Guantanamo. But I think in practice, this action is more significant for its symbolic value. It's signaling to people abroad the problems that we recognize that Guantanamo has caused with our image and our seeming commitment or lack of commitment to the rule of law. But what is the real policy outcome in terms of what our counterterrorism policies are? I think maybe not as great as the media and commentators have argued. First, on the question, what are we going to do with these prisoners? First, the executive order says, well, we're going to review their cases and order the release of people that we don't think are dangerous. Now, 800 people have been detained in Guantanamo in some way, shape, or form through the past 7 years, and there are only 245 there now, approximately. So that means 555 people have been reviewed and released by the Bush administration. So that's a policy that Bush had and was moving towards, and was, now, again, maybe the judgments on who can and who cannot release might be somewhat different, but that's to say that this is a sea change, I think, is incorrect. Second, Obama says we're going to try to transfer as many people to foreign countries who are in Guantanamo now, transfer them abroad. Bush had been doing that as well. Now, Obama might be more successful in negotiating with foreign countries to take these prisoners essentially off of our hands than Bush was able to. Basically, the rest of the world had said no thanks when the Bush administration State Department came by and said, please take some of these prisoners off our hands. But again, Bush was trying. Obama might be more successful, but again, not a large sea change in policy. Third option is to potentially prosecute some of these individuals. And Obama has said he's not going to use the military commission system that was set up by Congress after the Supreme Court struck down the one that the president had put into place. So he said no military commissions, but he hasn't said what's going to come in its place. His advisors have said we're going to try to prosecute as many of these people in civil court, federal Article III courts as possible, but not a single case has been transferred to an Article III court yet. And again, we just don't know if that's going to be possible or going to be able to do it. And when you look at Gitmo, the core significance of Gitmo over the 7 years is that it was an effort to do what we would call preventative detention, which was mean holding people that you thought were very dangerous, but you were not able to prosecute through the normal system in order to detain them. But Gitmo served as a way to keep what the administration said were dangerous people under wraps, so they weren't going to be a danger to us. And preventative detention is an anathema to the human rights community and is argued, matter of fact, this morning, the International, I think, Council of Jurists, which seem to be a group of human rights activists and scholars from abroad, issued a report decrying the counterterrorism policies of the last 7 years and named preventative detention as one that has been illegal and counterproductive. What does the executive order say about preventative detention? It certainly hasn't been ruled out. Section says determination of other dispositions. It's with respect to any individuals currently detained at Guantanamo who essentially we can't prosecute or transfer. The board shall review select lawful means consistent with the national security and foreign policy interests of the United States and the interests of justice for the disposition of such individuals. The appropriate authorities shall properly implement such dispositions. So again, the executive order doesn't rule out the potential of working with Congress potentially to create some type of preventative detention scheme. So while we're closing Guantanamo and changing the policies with respect to interrogation methods, I'm trying to argue again that there may be more continuity here than people give credit for. Rendition versus extraordinary rendition. Okay, those are terms, especially extraordinary rendition, which hasn't really been very well defined. But the idea of a rendition is the capture or kidnap, essentially, of somebody by the state authorities of a suspected terrorist who's in one country, transferring them somewhere else to face judicial process. So let's say we were to nab bin Laden. A rendition would be if we took bin Laden to the United States District Court in the Southern District of New York and prosecuted him there because there's an outstanding warrant for his arrest. That is the policy that the Clinton administration actually kind of initiated and then was expounded or expanded by the Bush administration to what we call extraordinary rendition, which is to pick up somebody not for the purpose of bringing them to justice in some other country, either ours or some third country, which is rendition, but extraordinary rendition, which is to take them to a third country or another country, not where there's an outstanding warrant, but to detain them, maybe in a secret facility, as the Bush administration did, or for interrogation purposes, which some argue or allege places where they could be abused and tortured. That would be extraordinary rendition. So Obama has not forsaken the entire idea of rendition, but matter of fact, his CIA director has said during his testimony that he'd go back to the Clinton policy of, yes, we will kidnap suspected terrorists and move them across international boundaries. We just will not send them to some place where we suspect that they would be tortured. We're only going to do that when we have an outstanding judicial process. Now, that is a big change, and an important and an appropriate one. But again, I just want to point out it's not many advocates would say that even the rendition process itself is illegal. The domestic surveillance issue that really captured our attention and led to interesting meetings between White House officials and a sick attorney general at a hospital and all of that. When all was said and done, Obama voted for the bill to authorize essentially surveillance on international calls involving U.S. citizens without a specific warrant relating to that individual communication. And that has now been authorized by Congress, a form of warrantless surveillance involving U.S. citizens, unless, not that you can't target the U.S. citizen, but a U.S. citizen might be involved in, or somebody inside the United States. So Obama was on that side, and many Democrats voted against it. Patriot Act, which changed the legal standard for FISA warrants, which expanded the use of something called national security letters to exchange documents, lowered the threshold for pen registers and trap and trace devices, sneak and peek warrants. You don't hear any discussion about revisiting any of those policies or those expansions of executive authority to combat terrorism. There's no discussion of that at all. In the area of terrorism financing, cracking down on cross-continental and cross-national transactions and trying to shut down charities. The Obama administration has retained my personal friend, Stuart Levy, who is the Undersecretary for Terrorism Financing, to continue in the Obama administration. So clearly a signal of continuity, not change. Homeland Defense, an area that I study very closely. I challenge you to look at the Obama website and look at what he's proposing to do in Homeland Security and see much difference, if any, between what is said there and what is said in the national strategy on Homeland Security. The one area where I see a very significant departure and change is in what I call the ideological aspects of the conflict. Some people call this the war of ideas. I think that's a poor metaphor for a couple of reasons, which we can get into. But in this aspect of the conflict, which is the understanding that we have to engage not just in capturing, killing terrorists, building barriers at our borders, hardening our infrastructure, scanning databases to try to find terrorists before they get us. But if we're going to deal with this conflict in the long term, somehow we have to try to essentially mobilize people in the Muslim world to help us and help themselves to defeat this movement within global Islam, which is so destructive and dangerous. And here, I believe that there's been a sea change in some regards, and I'll explain the subtlety. But if you could encapsulate the Bush approach towards this aspect of the problem, he lectured the rest of the Muslim world back in 2001, saying you're either with us or with the terrorists, giving them a very stark either-or, Muslims of the world, an either-or, both of which are, in many respects, was unpalatable to the average Muslim person on the street. Bin Laden, the idea of violence against civilians, abhorrent and inconsistent with the principles of Islam, but teaming with the United States, who most Muslims in the world see as favoring Israel in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and being an aggressive actor against Muslim interest, also unpalatable in many guises. The Obama administration is, let's develop a dialogue based on mutual respect. And that's an entirely different metaphor and approach for how to try to deal with this ideological conflict that is fueling so much of our of the movement and the violence that has emerged from it. And just to explain why, let me just digress and tell you about a talk I heard on Friday. An anthropologist named Scott Atrend, who studies these movements and political violence around the world. And he told me about a study they had done by interviewing lots of Palestinians. And they did this game where they would say, okay, in terms of trying to make peace with Israel, and they would say, okay, let's say you could give up your idea of the right of return to Palestine and acknowledge the existence of Israel as a state, and you could get, $100,000 in exchange. Would you kind of make that? Is that a deal that you could accept? And they would see what percentage of people would accept that. Then they would say, okay, let's say you could get $500,000 in exchange for doing that. It turns out that fewer people would accept the $500,000 than would accept the $100,000. And what they take from that is this idea is when you're that this, to the Palestinians, is not an issue that you can just engage in in rational choice, barter types of negotiations. That this is so much of what we're talking about here is wrapped up in what he called sacred values, that when you offer more money, you're offending the sacred value even more. So that offends more people and makes them less willing to take the bargain. So then they ask them, what if you got no money at all, but Israel apologized for atrocities committed against the Muslim Palestinian people? That answer got more positive responses than the $100,000 or the $500,000. So my point in just digressing into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict there is just to show that this idea of trying to engage in a mutually enforcing dialogue based on mutual respect and trying to identify joint interests going forward between the Muslim people and the West is on the right track. It's a metaphor that I think has some chance of success based on what Atrend was saying about how people feel about these sacred values which surround this whole conflict and debate. So I see a big sea change there, but again, I will also say that although Bush said you're either with us or with the terrorists back in 2001, I truly believe that their hearts wanted to have a policy that was much more in line with what Obama is going to try to be doing over the next 4 years. if you look at, starting the Annapolis peace process, way too late in my estimation, doing a lot more outreach to the Muslim world, things like public diplomacy. These are things that Bush administration wanted to do, but the Iraq War just diverted them and made it virtually impossible for them to have an effective policy in this regard. And they just were not able to really pull it off because so much water had kind of gone under the bridge by the time they realized how important this aspect of their counterterrorism policies were. So again, Bush wasn't able to do it, didn't really do it, but probably kind of wanted to. Now Obama's going in that direction. So again, I don't see that as something that is so dramatically different from what their intentions and ideas were. So that's kind of my my thoughts, and maybe you'll have reactions and show me why I'm all wrong. But with that, we have plenty of time to talk about either what I said this afternoon or anything else that's on your mind. Thank you.
I'll go.
Okay.
One of the biggest issues regarding the Bush administration's response was how Bush interacted with Congress and the unitary executive theory. It's my impression that presidents very rarely willingly cede any of their Article 2, Section 2 powers to Congress, but it's also my understanding that President Eisenhower felt that his actions would be most lasting if they were done in concert with Congress, as opposed to doing something which was slightly exerting his power slightly more, but acting without Congress's agreement. How do you think, Obama's probably going to have congressional agreements on most of these issues for the foreseeable future, but how do you think that a president should view an adversarial Congress when he's looking at foreign policy issues like this?
Well, you've put a lot on the plate there. Let me see if I can answer some of those things. If I don't do it adequately, you can come back with another question. But first of all, I don't necessarily equate the Bush administration agenda on executive power necessarily with counterterrorism. I think that was an agenda that it had that leaked very quickly and became the centerpiece in the counterterrorism policies, but I think they had that agenda regardless. And I think it's about the dumbest aspect of their entire counterterrorism policies was to infuse them with this notion of the imperial presidency that Article 2 vested them with all kinds of powers that allowed them to trump ideas of Congress. It was especially stupid tactically because if you could have reached out to the Congress, Republicans had the House of Representatives the entire time of Bush's term, except the last 2 years, but during the first term, and then all but a small time in the Senate. Bush would have been able to get agreement for pretty much everything that he wanted to do in that regard. So I think it was a critical mistake and led to a lot of the public erosion and skepticism and lack of trust that then came back to haunt many other initiatives, especially Iraq, and has led to the largest Democratic majority of recent memory. So then your question is, how should an executive try to interact with Congress on foreign policy and national security? And I think you ignore Congress at your peril. It is a co-equal branch. It is difficult to manage, 535 individuals. It's very difficult to run a foreign policy. I recognized that when I went on congressional delegations on occasion, and you would meet with the ambassador beforehand. The ambassador would say, this is the message that we would really like you, members of Congress, to convey to this head of state that you're going to meet with. And everybody's understand, great, that's exactly what we're going to do. And then they get in the room and they all pursue totally their own agenda, going off in different tangents and saying things that are sometimes totally inconsistent with what the ambassador just said were the interests and the policies of the United States. So, I mean, I've seen that firsthand, how you cannot run foreign policy through a multi-party legislature. Is not a multi-person legislature is not a good way to go. Nonetheless, I just think that you have to make every effort to try to gain consensus, and gaining consensus helps you on partisan issues, and it helps you ultimately retain public support for your activities, because when you get things like a authorization for the use of force, like the administration did for both Iraq and for post 9/11, listen, you're in a much more secure position to take aggressive action, and you're much more likely to bring the country with you over the long term. So while it's not always possible, and you can't include Congress in every decision, I think over the long term, a process of lots of consultation, communication, when you need legislation, when you want to do something, to try to move it through the legislative process is really the way to go, even if the other side is in control of one or the other house. Yes, and then Steve.
I have a comment and a question. It seems almost like, well, I mean, firstly, continuity is inevitable with the change of the president, because the government still continues, even though the top man is different. So inevitably, there should be continuity and not just rapid change, right? So when you talk about, for example, the policies which are continuing without really changing, it sounds almost like you're likening Obama to Bush in a way. The question would rather be, to add on to that, the change that one expects or that one hopes to see is a, like I said, the ideological change, sort of a seemingly less primitive manner in dealing with other countries. For example, when you're talking about infringing on the sovereignty of other states, it sounds very primitive, and one hopes that the government under the Obama leadership would have a different view of interacting via its foreign policies. The question I have as a journalist from South Africa is, do you think that the counter-terrorism policies and foreign policies are communicated effectively to the citizenry of this country?
Well, on your question, are the policies communicated effectively to the country? I mean, I think that we had an administration that was overly secretive, both with the American people and with other countries in terms of what our policies were and what we were going to be doing, which, while sometimes necessary, in the long run, I think are not going to lead to effective policies and again, maintaining public support over the long run. But in terms of continuity, you don't necessarily get continuity just because everybody in the rest of the government, you do have a whole change in an administration. It's just not the president that changes, it's all the political appointees, some 3,000 of them that are running the various agencies in the government. But that takes a lot of time to get those people in place. So maybe we will see more dramatic change. My point is that we've been talking as if there's been a sea change already, and I think that those differences are being overblown for both political and kind of sensationalist impulses.
And you may have answered this already, since you said that you don't see big changes in Homeland Security, at least not so far. But one of the things that's happened since 9/11 is a thickening of the borders, especially the land borders, or NCers, anybody with an Islamic name going through extra checks and so on to get into the United States. Do you see any inclination to roll that back or make it more precise or fine-tune it, or do you think that's another area where continuity will be more likely than dramatic change?
Well, I wouldn't put tinkering with the rules of NCers, and I'm not familiar with the details of it. I know it was started on a much more sweeping fashion and then even scaled very far back under Asa Hutchinson and his initial actions in the Department of Homeland Security. So, I mean, I'm not sure that's the best example because the administration itself pulled back. So I wouldn't see that adjustments like that. Immigration, I think, is in general, in terms of will Obama continue the large-scale hardening of the border? I mean, I know Napolitano was, as a border state governor, agreed with some of the things that the Bush administration and disagreed with others. So I think you will see some changes in various aspects of immigration policy. But again, I don't, and maybe we'll see an additional effort to pass comprehensive immigration reform in the Congress. But of course, Bush was in favor of it. It was people in his own party who torpedoed it. That was an initiative of Bush that Obama was supporting. So, if you're looking at large scale in terms of what of our policies are going to be, and I believe Obama said on the campaign trail as well that of course we have to secure the border and reduce illegal immigration as much as possible. Whether he'll, continue the infrastructure investments on mostly the southern border. I know you're mostly interested in the northern border. I don't know. I think it's a little too early to tell. I haven't seen. Maybe you could tell us if you've seen indications on that. Please, and then you.
A lot of the senior executives in the intelligence community are baby boomers who are approaching retirement, and a lot of them were trained with a Cold War mindset, and under the earlier Bush vision that you mentioned of you're either with us or against us. And with them, they make up such a large portion of the senior executives that with the approach of retirement, you could see a sea change. Do you think there's potential for that moving on the bureaucratic level to more of an Obama mindset, emphasizing legitimacy and dialogue?
I don't think the genesis for your for with us or against us was from the senior executive portions of the civil service and the intelligence community. As a matter of fact, I think the evidence seems to suggest that it was senior civil servants that were warning the administration that its adventure in Iraq was going to blow up in its face because they didn't understand the local cultures and the divisions within Iraqi society that were going to blossom once Saddam was taken down. So, much of this philosophy over the last 8 years was something that was really initiated by the kind of intelligentsia of the Bush administration, and they very much saw lots of elements of the civil service, the permanent civil service, whether it be in the State Department or the Justice Department or the CIA, as obstacles that they overcame or pushed aside or ignored or did things to intimidate to push forward their objectives. So I don't think I buy into that thesis. Yeah, you are going to be seeing a lot of retirement in senior civil service, and that's a big problem in terms of what we call human capital within the government. That we're going to be losing a lot of our expertise, and but I see that. I don't see that as an ideological issue. I see that as one of of getting more people interested in serving. Hopefully, many of you serving the government, taking your substantial credentials and putting them toward some public service, and getting the training and all you need to do those jobs effectively. I'm not sure if I answered your question or.
I think you largely. Well, my sister, she's like a GS-15. She rose up really fast, and she says there's a sort of a military structure in place where it's not based on incentives. It's based on like how much time you put in, and so so there's a lot of even former military that the Bush administration put in power positions, and if there were a sea change, you would see a change in the way that people are advanced in the system and encourage more people, from universities, from top law schools to go in, because right now I don't think a lot of us would be interested in doing that because the opportunities for career advancement aren't there.
No, that's Yeah, it's an interesting perspective and one I had heard before. Certainly, there has been a bit of a militarization of the civil service, and you see that a lot in Homeland Security, where military people were put in high-level positions, and maybe also in high-level civil service jobs or former military. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. Military, armed forces bring with them a lot of excellent characteristics in terms of leadership, ability to execute programs, ability to develop command structure. I mean, we saw Katrina. We didn't get it all sorted out until we got some military folks running the show. So I think I wouldn't bring that bias to it, but I am concerned about general militarization of civil society. I think that's a trend that we've definitely headed in, and that would be better to have, as you say, more of a mix. Please.
Regarding Guantanamo, there is a problem. We know what to do basically with the real bad guys and the ones who have no interest. What about those in the middle? The ones who are dangerous but can be charged in front of the civil court. Do you have an idea of what to do with them?
Well, I'm not sure it breaks down into bad guys and kind of bad guys. It breaks down into people. I don't think they'd still be there after 7 years if somebody in the government didn't think that they were a big problem. We've identified most of the people who were in the wrong place at the wrong time and should have never been in there in the first place. Perhaps a small percentage of the 245 are also people who are in the wrong place at the wrong time. Hopefully we'll figure out who those people are and send them somewhere else. But what it breaks down to is that people that we have sufficient admissible evidence that we could actually put into some sort of judicial process and have some confidence of getting a conviction so they could be detained for the long term. And other people who we either don't have sufficient evidence, or the evidence that we have is not admissible because it was procured by illegitimate, highly coercive means. And we've actually, the head of the Guantanamo prosecutors, the convening authority, was interviewed by Bob Woodward in January and has the first admission that there was an individual, very high-value individual, the so-called 20th hijacker, who she admit was, in her judgment, was tortured. I mean, they said that none of the techniques that were used against this individual amounted to torture, but the cumulative effects did constitute torture. So we can't try that person, but we also probably it's not in our national interest to release him. And I haven't heard anybody from the Obama administration explain what they're going to do with those people. There aren't many good options. You could either continue to hold them pursuant to the law of war, which allows you to hold a combatant, even somebody you designate as a POW. You can hold them till the end of hostilities. And that is the one part of this entire scheme. 4 times the Supreme Court. That is the only principle that the Supreme Court has actually sided with the Bush administration on, which is that a combatant in an armed conflict, if captured, could be detained until the end of hostilities. And they said that somebody who was picked up in Afghanistan, Yasser Hamdi, was legitimately detained, is an enemy combatant, and could be detained technically until the end of hostilities. The problem is, in classic terms of war, hostilities have always ended at some point. But this is a war which may last decades or forever. And now that the Supreme Court has said that prisoners at Guantanamo have rights to appeal their decisions, the decision to detain them in the U.S. federal courts through habeas corpus, at some point the courts are going to run out of patience with the idea that hostilities can last forever. So that's one option, but it has its limits. The other option is going to Congress and getting some, or through international law, which I think would be even a more difficult process, but going to Congress and getting some sort of what I call preventative detention law applied to a narrow class, probably not of citizens, U.S. citizens, of foreign nationals who are detained. We have some sort of process to determine that if some check on whether these individuals constitute a threat to the national security, and if they do, that they could be detained for long term without a trial. That would be an anathema to the human rights community, but that is the other option. Maybe there's some other good options, some smarter people than me. I haven't heard those, what we're going to do with those people yet. Please.
Just a couple of days ago, Admiral Blair mentioned how he felt now that the fallout from the global economic crisis was the #1 threat to U.S. national security over and above terrorism. I don't know to what extent you agree with him, but also I'm wondering to what extent you think that we're going to see the Obama administration, while specifically in sort of counterterrorism, homeland defense policy, there might be a lot of continuity with the Bush administration. We might see the Obama administration redefining national security more broadly to include things like income inequality in the world, poverty, global climate change, all of these other issues, and putting them in the national security equation.
Well, Clinton certainly viewed economic prosperity and globalism as issues that related to national security. Didn't really get much of a start on climate change. I think you're right. I think that's accurate to consider those as part of the national security equation, and I do think that Obama will view it as such. Again, we were talking about counterterrorism policy here, so I was making a narrower point than that. But I agree that you will see a break in that regard. The Admiral Blair's comments, I think, are very interesting and insightful. One of the big questions is, why do individuals radicalize? Why do people choose to take up violence to try to achieve an aim, and why are they doing so in the Muslim world in larger numbers than we see in other kinds of political conflicts, and using tactics that are larger scale and are considerably more dangerous than we've seen in other kinds of political violence in the past? Now, we don't really know a lot of the answer to that is, but one thing the evidence does strongly show is that it's not necessarily because of poverty. Matter of fact, when you look at the people who become terrorists or join terrorist organizations, you find they are more frequently come from middle-class groups than the poor. But I don't think that means Admiral Blair is wrong, because your average poor person just doesn't have the time, energy, or wherewithal to, they're worrying about how to get through the next day, how to put food on their plates. It's people who have maybe some means, but time on their hands, disenchantment about not getting a better job, a better understanding of what is available in the West, and a sense of grievance that their lives are not better. And I would think and that leads them to a feeling of disenchantment, that they want something different, more exciting, better in their lives. They join up with some of their friends, peers who have met this great preacher in the mosque who's telling them about what they could get in the afterlife, and the whole understanding of what the Quran tells them to do. People who are not particularly religious or educated about Islam, and off they go down the path of radicalization. I could see, if that is indeed the narrative about how somebody comes from being maybe a angry person, but not necessarily one who's willing to blow themselves up. If that's the path that one goes down, I could see that definitely being exacerbated greatly by the global economic crisis, and also increasing hostility towards the United States. Because, frankly, much of the narrative about all their problems being caused by the U.S., in my estimation, is wrong. But in this case, they're right. We did cause all of this. This was all of our fault. So that would be a source of grievance that could be directed very much towards us, and I think it's a big problem. Did you have your hand up before? No?
I
Okay.
think we're going to do one more.
One more
quick
question?
I guess.
Okay, go ahead.
I'm a journalist from Afghanistan. I have a question. What are the challenges for the Obama administration? Yesterday we had the interview with Karzai with the BBC. He was very hopeless, and he was saying that since Obama came to power, he hasn't been in contact with Obama administration. What do you think?
I think you're outside my lane, son. I'm not closely following necessarily everything to do with Afghanistan. I think you're much more up to date than me. Clearly, Afghanistan's a very big challenge for us. I don't think the administration has clearly announced what its ultimate objectives are and how we're going to go about it and what the future of the Karzai government is. So I think I'd be speculating if I kind of tried to answer your question, so don't know.
Well, we'll end on a good note.
Actually, can I make a public service announcement?
Yeah, absolutely, please.
I work with the State Department, and actually I'm a recruiter for the Foreign Service here at Duke. And getting back to the question about generational change and militarization of Homeland Security, at least in the Foreign Service, practically half the members of the Foreign Service were hired in the last 5 years. Secretary Powell made a huge effort to bring in new people, and that's actually being renewed and will probably be even greater in the next couple of years. So the generational change, the sort of mentality, is very much not sort of Cold War. It's people like you. So I would hope you'd reconsider that thought about, and thank you for the plug, about working for federal government, because there's probably never been a time when we need bright young minds like yours asking the kinds of questions you're asking. And also, the federal government's hiring more people, especially the State Department. So, you know, if that law degree is not going to pay off, think about government service. You won't get rich, but you'll be able to serve your country.
All right, I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you for inviting me.